Hello, in this episode I'm going to talk about how to create hand-painted bricks. This is going to be the first of many tutorials on hand-painted materials, and the idea is that you can use this in any painting software or any 3D software with painting tools. I'm using Blender 2.79 at the moment. I'm not going to go through in much detail about how to set up for painting. It's the techniques that you use to paint that I'll be going through, and they'll be the same in any software. This is all part of a much bigger course on gabbit.co.uk where you can go right through from beginner to advanced levels, and all the courses are free. Also, you can get across to the Discord server. All the links are in the description, and you can chat to people on there. Also, you can get across to the Discord server and chat to people on there about the tutorials or about any Blender related issues. You can show off your artwork and join in the competitions and challenges, and all the links are in the description. Okay, so I have a basic cube in the center of my scene, and I've changed the shading to smooth, as you can see there. Now with smooth shading it does go a bit weird, so I've added a bevel on, so that's add modifier bevel, and when you see that, it suddenly makes it easier to see the edges. You may want to hand paint and start off in flat, but you'll always want to end up in smooth shading and let the painting show the edges. Okay, so we need to set this cube up for painting. Now this will be different for the different software you're using, and it may be different for Blender 2.8. I'll put a link in the corner when I do a tutorial for 2.8, but there's a link in the corner at the moment for 2.79, and all links will be in the description. So first of all, I'll bring out my UV image editor and my node editor. I'll change the cycles as well, of course. I'll create a new material down here for my object. We'll just use diffuse for the moment, and I'll create a new texture. I'm going to call this bricks color, and I'll change the texture size to 2048 by 2048. We don't need an alpha channel, so I'll turn that off and press OK. Now we just need to add that texture into our node editor. Shift A, texture, image texture, hook them up and select our brick color. Now we are ready to paint. Over to texture paint mode, and I've made a slight error because I haven't unwrapped my object. That's fine. Into edit mode with tab, U to unwrap, and let's do a smart UV project. You can get away with a smart UV project, especially when you're painting. I've put the island margin up slightly, and there is my UV unwrap. Now when I go to paint mode, it's all ready to paint, and we can just quickly test it. That's fine. So let's start painting the rock texture. But before I do that, let's just show you what I've got on my other screen. I've got some reference images of brick textures here and here. It's a really good idea, no matter how well you think you know the topic that you're painting, to have some sort of reference to anchor your thoughts. So I'll put that to one side. What I'm going to start with is a sort of grey-blue colour. I'm going to do a fill, so I'll go to the fill brush, and I will find my colour. A mid-grey should do nicely, and in fact we'll leave it a completely mid-grey for now. So when I fill, by pressing it a few times, my strength is down to 0.5. You can see it's a nice mid-grey colour, but what you will notice is that the seams are showing some black lines. Now what we need to do in Blender is go to our options and change our bleed to something like 12. And now when I fill, it will go over those edges. And there's still a tiny bit there, so let's change to 14 to make absolutely sure. And we can see it going over the edges here. Now in this case, which is rare, we can still see some slight lines there. So what I'm going to do, change in my UV image editor to paint mode, bring the tools up with T, and fill the whole texture in with grey. I probably should have started with the grey texture in the first place rather than using the fill. That was a bit silly. But the good thing is that it did illustrate the point about the seams. Okay, so back to tools and back to my normal texture draw brush. Now for the second part, I don't want to do my bricks just yet. I want to create a base colour which is not just grey but has some variations. And what I'm going to do is use my texture mask. So this is basically the brush head. If I go to texture, that's where you can put in things like stencils and images. But for a texture mask, that's your actual brush head. I'll show you what I mean. So I'm going to create a new texture mask, come over to my textures and go to my brush texture and change that to clouds. As you can see, it changes over here. And I'll change the cloud size slightly, and that's a nice bit of variation there. Now you can see when I press F to resize, you can see my brush is actually using the cloud texture. So now I can change this to a mid-grey. In fact, I'm just going to sample that grey with S to sample, and now I've got a color palette. And let's go to a slightly blue and paint. Okay, I'm going to just move this across so I can see more of my cube, and fill in with a different range of colours. Just gently, with not too high a strength. Be careful when you're on the absolute edge here and you paint, it will stretch across this side. That will become more important when we paint the details, but just be aware of that. Be careful not to saturate too much, that's very saturated, and this is less saturated of course. And try and keep them generally within this middle area, and make sure there's an even distribution. If at any point you feel it's a bit too colourful, you can tone back your colour with the fill, bring that strength down, and we're still on the mid-grey, and fill it once or twice, depending on how saturated you feel it's gotten. So I think that's a good starting point. So let's go back to my texture draw brush. So at this point I want to draw on my brick patterns. I'm going to make quite big bricks, just so I'm a bit quicker. And the way I'm going to do that, rather than just choose a dark brush and paint, I'm actually going to change the brush type, turn the texture off for now, and change it to multiply. Multiply is to darken objects. I'm going to bring my brush size right down to about here. I'm also going to, for speed's sake, go down to my options at the bottom and choose symmetry, and turn symmetry in the x-axis on. And in fact, I'm going to turn it on in the y-axis as well, just for now, just to start off with. Tiny bit smaller with the brush. And when you've got multiply on, make sure you are slightly dark with your colour. I should say tone, sorry. Let's zoom in and start drawing our lines. And now I don't want them to be too straight, but we could use the line stroke just here. If you really want them very straight, that's fine. I'll show you what that looks like. Get the line stroke, draw your line, and there we go. Now that's mirrored, you can see, so that's causing us a bit of problems there. If I want to do that properly, I'd have to go from this corner to the middle, and that should be mirroring on the underside as well. So we'll undo that. I'd rather use my usual space, and I'm going to create it with 3 layers of bricks. So one around about here, and one about here. Notice I'm not worrying too much about this overlap here. I'm going to do the same around the edge here. So nice and simple for now. This kind of roughness is okay at the moment, and my wobbliness of my lines. It's a bit tricky because I've got the microphone in the way of my drawing. I'll create a brick line just here then, and I'll go across the top slightly. I say slightly, it's actually all the way. And come down here for a brick. It's unlikely you're going to have a very cuboid brick wall as well, so this pattern might not quite work out fully. Now when you're going down the middle, you might want to turn symmetry off. In the Y is fine though, because it's on the other side. That will help us in fact. But symmetry in the X turned off, and then I can go a bit more wobbly with my line. If I have symmetry turned on and I go wobbly, you can see it creates this sort of mess. So turning symmetry off is good at this point anyway. So I'll put it back on the X and on the Y now, and off on the Y I should say, and put that brick there. Okay, so let's zoom out. That doesn't look too bad. It's a good start, and you can see the variation in the brick. That's great, but of course we can make this a bit better. So first of all, let's create differences in our bricks shading slightly. So let's go back to our texture mask. If you click on the actual texture part, you can click the cloud again, and you've got that back. Put the brush size up, and we'll give them very slightly different variations of colour. Remember, you've got the mirror turned on still. I'll turn them both on for now whilst I'm dealing with the corner ones. Oh, and watch out as well if you've got the multiply brush on still. It should be back to mix. That's a mistake I often make. So you can see why I'm saying about the corner ones are okay whilst you've got the mirror on, but these are looking too similar now. So turning mirror on and off throughout your painting to save time is a good idea, but don't make them too symmetrical. So the corner ones, that's okay to do. Don't go too saturated with these colours as well. I should be closer to mid-grey really, because that's the original colour. Okay, we'll put in a bit of darker variation as well. I'll turn the mirror off now. You can see I'm being fairly rough with this, because these colours will eventually be covered up. If ever you lose your centre point, Alt F will take you back so you've got your center point and you can move around your viewport easily. Okay, so you can see I've still not added any detail. I want a bit more shading. I want a tiny bit of depth in some of the bricks so that some stick out more and others dig in more. So I'm going to make this one, for example, a bit darker. This time I'll go to my multiply brush again, make my texture a bit darker, and let's put it to pure white this time. Sorry, pure grey I should say, with it a bit darker, and give it a touch of depth. I'll make my brush a bit smaller so I can be a bit more precise here. And I'm going around the edge. I'm going to take my texture off for now as well, and bring my strength down. So it should look a bit like that one's going inwards slightly, but that's a bit too much. I'm going to undo that and bring it down a bit more so I've got a bit more control with my brush. That's good. And just do that in areas to create variation. It's a good idea to think roughly where the light's coming from, but in other terms it's not so great, because if this is a game asset, the lights might be moving around all over the place, so you want to give it a generic lighting. So more like just general ambient occlusion and cavity. So I'm thinking to myself, this one's going to stick out a bit more than these other ones, so I've got a bit of shading around it like that. I'll find some other ones that I think might do that as well, maybe this one here. So I'll go around it gently, just adding that bit of shading. Looks a bit like a strange Battenberg cake at the moment, but hopefully we can sort that out in a bit. Now at the moment, I'm just going over with a tiny bit of variation. So I think it's a bit bright at the moment. Give the rocks a tiny bit of darkness in places, as if they've got slight dents in them. One thing I always forget is the bottom. Okay, so that's great. Let's think about some highlights now. Not full highlight, so none of the details yet. We start with the big shapes and go to the details last. What I mean is just general highlights of maybe these bricks being slightly lighter because they're sticking up. So I make my brush lighter and then go to screen mode. Screen and multiply are the two modes which are the best for brightening and darkening your objects, because they maintain some of the color information. So that one should look a bit like it's sticking up, which is working to a degree there. It's not too bad. And I'm going around the edges as if they're standing out from the other ones. I'm also adding a tiny bit more to the middle of them as well. In fact, what I should be doing is creating an area up here. 3D view, which is zoomed out a bit so we can see what it's looking like. You can see that I'm keeping my brush fairly big at this stage, because I don't want to get tempted into any minor details. Okay, so let's start working on a bit more of the detail. I'll keep on my screen brush and I'm going to highlight the edges of these bricks. Not so much the ones that are deep, just the ones that are sticking out or fairly even around the place. So I'll bring my brush down a bit with F and come in a bit. I'll keep it to a low strength still, just to test it out to start with. And in fact, that's not a good place to start because that should be in a slight deep crevice. I'll start with this one that's supposed to stick out a bit. So the corners or very edges of things that stick out should be slightly lighter, because that's what's brushing against things and catching the light. So in general, they have a brightness to them. I can do a second pass of this later, so just getting that basics down for the sake of speed. And can you see where I'm right on the corner? I'm putting in a bit more of that whiteness. And can you see that hopefully standing out a bit now from the other ones? Now you can see I went a bit weird there, but I can sort of tidy that up later, and it's good to have a bit of variation in your shape. Only happy accidents, as Bob Ross would say. Just try and watch out for little bits where you've put some shading in. So you can maybe go over little bits where the corners might catch light, but generally try and keep them in the shade if you've put shading on them already. Occasionally I'm putting just a tiny bit of swirliness inside the bricks, just for variation whilst I'm there. So before I go any further, I'll just quickly change the colours of this purple one here. It looks a bit too purpley. So let's go back to my mid-grey and my mix. Make sure I'm completely at mid-grey by clicking all these up to 1, and then moving the grayscale down. Then you know you're right at the middle. You can also go to HSV, and then it's just the value that you have to push, and the saturation level is just there, which is a bit easier and quicker really. And I'll bring my texture mask back and put a little bit in there, just so it's not quite as colourful. I'll turn this off tiled as well. I'll put it on random. I think that's a better option really. Okay, that's a bit better and less saturated and less colourful. So at this point it's starting to get there. They're looking like separate bricks. Now we can start adding detail in each brick. I'll start with just one, so I'll start with this one on the corner. So this is where I start going to the more fine detail. So first of all, let's smarten up the dent. Let's go to our multiply brush again. Make sure my colour is slightly darker than mid-grey, and bring my brush right down for a bit more detail. And so we're going to make this crevice seem more realistic. Might want to put the strength of that up slightly, and take my texture mask off. That will help. And occasionally you might want to make sort of little dents in the brickwork like that. So this one can come up here slightly. And we're starting to get a bit more to the nitty-gritty. So now it's really starting to look more like a brick. I'm going lightly on these spots and then dark where it really goes into the crevice. I might do the same with this brick underneath slightly. I'll just put a light dent in here. Okay, and at this point I can then go to my screen brush, bring it up in terms of the tone, and then just go on these edges as if the light's being caught. And in here, just on that edge there, like this. And you can see this sort of brick texture coming out now. Now this is where it starts taking time, and the detailed phase is where you do need to spend more effort. And you get slightly different variations of shade, so it looks more rocky. And occasionally you can have a tiny little highlight like this, and it looks like there's a small bit that sticks out. So if you want to do a sort of dent or crack, perhaps going across here, with my multiply brush on, I can do a sort of slight mark here. So let's say it's sort of been dented somehow because it's right on the corner. So we come out a bit there and then thinner as we go down, and it gets darker towards the middle and maybe very dark right in the center. And that already looks quite nice, but then when we go to our screen brush and put our highlights on, you can see over here, bit of a distance out, looks great. Depending on how far your crack goes is how far you want to put your multiply brush, but it thins out right towards the end. And little dinks here and there are good too. It's a quicker workflow to do all your shading first and then all your highlights second, so you don't have to keep changing brushes. Also, what I do is I usually set up a dark brush and a light brush, so I can just quickly go up here, choose a brush, rather than going down here and here for each of them. So there's some dinky details. With my multiply brush on as well, I can give it a bit of texture. Bring the strength right down for this, maybe bring the size up just a touch, and let's sort of create a bit of texture around here, a bit of a swirly texture that sort of digs in slightly. So I'm gradually fading it out, so it's darker here and lighter out here. And then right in here, it's going to get a bit more dark. And let's get the screen back. It seems to move every time, which I really don't understand. Make my brush a bit smaller for the highlight. Just highlight tiny bits of it. And you can see over here, it looks like there's a slight dent in the brickwork. And that works quite nicely. I'm just going to set up my brushes, show you what I mean. You click down here with new brush. I'm going to call this light and make sure it's on screen. Click again and call this one dark. Make sure they're there, so there's dark and there's light. And the dark brush I'll change to multiply. Occasionally you might want an end that sort of edges off and being chipped as it's been weathered. So you might want to come in with a corner like this and round it off. And again, put a highlight on the edge there. I'll just go around doing a few of those. Also, for bricks that are dented in, you might want to really sort out the shading and think exactly how is this going to look. So maybe shade them right back on one corner as you sort of get a feel for exactly how they're going to sit. And you can see that's got a nice dent in there now. And one tool that may be useful for you is the smear brush. So here there's a lot of lines where my multipliers rubbed over each other. I can smear those out. The smear brush could also be useful if you've made a mistake and you think, oh, I've got too many of these divots or whatever it might be. You can use the smear brush to kind of rub things out. So put the strength up perhaps, and then you can slowly go over it. As you can see here, there we go, it's working now. One part as well which I haven't mentioned yet is these corners and these edges here. They'll certainly be a lot lighter because that's where the light's going to catch and things will brush up against this object. So let's go to our light brush and make it fairly big like this with a nice low strength. And just go across it gently. Subtlety is key here. And a fair bit right on the very corner. Should have done this a bit earlier before doing the dents. That's also why I prefer working with a beveled cube. The sharp pointy corners don't really work so well with this. Very occasionally you'll get problems like this. The smear brush usually fixes them. And it's just where your seams join, and it's a glitch in Blender. I haven't really found a good way of fixing this, ever. I might try turning my bleed down, just in case that's overlapping, but I don't think it ever is. It really is just a glitch that is really difficult to get around. Luckily it's not too noticeable from far away. But if anybody knows what that sort of thing is and how I can deal with that, then please let me know. Okay, so I think I'll leave it there. So I've been recording for about 1.25 hours. I'm still not an amazing artist, but if you watch my recent blog post, it's all about practice. And hopefully some of these tips will help you to figure out ways of painting these types of things. Watch out for future episodes, and thanks for watching.